Jack, when were you born? What's your birthday?
6/5/1942. Prior to going in the Navy, I was in the body business with Wally Jackson, and learned an awful lot from him. And I had a good experience there. And I decided it was like sort of dead end at that point, so I went in the Navy. Well, you know, there was a television show on called Silent Service. And I fell in love with that show. And I liked the Navy uniforms.
You could do your boot camp or your original
Great Lakes.
Great Lakes?
Yeah, I enjoyed it very much. I think the whole thing was I needed to grow up. Mm-hmm. And I think I wasn't seeing or feeling a lot of that. And so boot camp did a good job for me. And the rest is probably good, positive history, because I learned a lot fast, because the multitude of people that you're established with from the various big cities, little cities, rural areas, and that, you learn a lot of things fast about life. And even life on the streets in New York City, because we had some fellas that were from various boroughs of New York City in boot camp with me. And I'm easy to make friends with, and I befriended these fellas like they'd been lifelong friends. And I learned a lot of their ways in that. Some of them good, some of them bad. For the most part, they were good, because I never did get in any trouble or anything. Had an honorable discharge. Went to Bainbridge, Maryland. It was a Naval Academy prep school. It was the Wave boot camp. It was it had A and B schools, naval schools, radio school, and there was a big computer contingency there that was just getting started. One of them was called Pamiconis, and the other was called Eptoconis. Would you be interested in going into cooking? And I said, well, yeah. They said it's very clean, long hours. We were cooking for like 1,500 people a day at Bainbridge, Maryland, because there was such a contingency of people there for various reasons. And we did that for just about a year, and I got called into the office one morning, and they said, you're going to be transferred here shortly. And I said, where to? And they said, well, we're going to give you some choices. They gave me 3 choices, and I didn't get any of them, which is kind of typical. To Little Creek, Norfolk, Virginia, which is the home of the SEALs. Today, back then, we worked with UDT, which evolved into, were grandfathered into the SEALs. And I befriended quite a few of them, and they were very, very nice fellas, and they helped me tremendously. And I got assigned to a unit called Assault Craft Unit 2.
Okay.
And they had just changed their name in 1959 when I got out of boot camp, from Boat Unit 2 from World War II to Assault Craft Unit 2. And I didn't understand anything about it. And I got indoctrinated, and then I ended up on a pier probably the 3rd or 4th day I was there, landing crafts. And these were just single tank landing crafts with a 4-man crew. And they said, by the way, you're going to be working a little bit heavy right now. I said, why? He said, because President Kennedy wants us to do a mock landing at Morehead City, North Carolina. And I said, what's that all about? Well, we don't know. All we know is we need to do it for him. And I said, okay. So he says, what you're going to be doing? He says, you're going to be taking all the paint off these boats, right down to the bare metal. And so they had these, what they call deck crawlers, electric deck crawlers that would be almost like fingers that would spin. There was about 12 of them in a row, maybe 10 or 12 of them in a row. And the vibration was phenomenal on those boats, because it's a telescopic situation, because everything is hollow basically on those steel boats. We saw President Kennedy on this big pier that stuck out, gosh, almost a mile from shore. Big, huge pier out there in his tan top coat and the hair blowing in the wind and everything, you know, and probably a dozen ships from the horizon in, you could see them. And what our job was to offload those ships with our landing crafts. And I didn't know a whole lot about what was going on, so I just kept my ears open and watched and did what I was told, and everything worked out. And they were also filming the parts of the longest day of the movie at the same time, which we learned later. And there were supposedly some stars there that were in the movie, but we never saw them or anything. Right. Because they were stationed to, you know, one landing craft. And so that was the first taste I got of a landing operation, which was simple because it wasn't really a beach. It was a huge cement ramping at the shoreline. And I asked if Jack Anderson was there, and yeah, I'm right here. He said, you need to get back over and unload your locker and be aboard ship in 15 minutes. I said, what's going on? We can't tell you.
Oh, wow.
I said, what do you mean you can't? Just do what you're told. I said, okay, fine. We have everything rolled in our lockers 4 speeds, so all I had to do was just take my sea bag and have it set there, and I just scooped everything out in the sea bag and sealed it, threw it over my back, went down on the LCMA landing craft medium 8 that I was on, and we headed out. It was the USS Rushmore, and I don't know if you know anything about LSDs or not. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I do.
I call it a giant pickup truck. That's what I call it, with a big hydraulic tailgate. Yeah. And so we loaded into the LSD along with quite a few others. I think there was 5 of us all together in there, and so the ship got underway within 2 hours, and we headed out towards Cape Hatteras, and we headed. Now I know it was headed towards Cuba, but at that time I didn't know where we were heading or anything else, and nobody could tell us anything when we asked questions. We can't tell you. So for 5 days we steamed, and then finally the captain got us together, and he said, "Gotta tell you guys," he says, "so we're on a very dangerous mission." And I thinking to myself, what the heck is a dangerous mission? I don't see any land or anything. But I see a lot of ships. We're on an ordered blockade by the President of the United States. I said, what's that all about? Well, they started telling us all about the missiles in Cuba and everything. And I said, okay. And they said, we want to tell you that you guys may not be going back home. We've discovered that there's a multitude of missiles on the mainland of Cuba. And we had an operation back there about a year ago called the Bay of Pigs, and it failed miserably. And they're kind of laughing at us now, and the president doesn't like that. He doesn't take that very lightly. So he's preparing us to blockade all inboard shipping from Russia, and hopefully we won't have to do a landing, but we don't know what we're up against. What we didn't know is that the night before there was a television program on, and I just happened to be on the beach shooting pool and drinking beer, and got home, went to bed, and got up the next morning and went over to the I&E building. And I had never saw when President Kennedy came on and said what we were going to do. And evidently nobody else did, because nobody talked about it or knew what our situation was.
It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States.
About 13 days that we were under the gun with this Cuban Missile Crisis.
The aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and Marine forces of the Second Fleet under Vice Admiral Alfred G. Ward were poised to launch air, naval gunfire, and amphibious strikes against Soviet and Cuban forces ashore if the quarantine failed.
We went to Morehead City and we loaded up 2 Marine divisions, and we loaded up what I thought was about a mile long of tanks, and a huge amount of netting went out to the cargo ships, the APAs and the AKAs, that they were everything that you can think of: food, armament, communication gear, everything else went out to the different ships before we actually left Morehead City. And there was a detachment of UDT that went with us. Well, most of the ships had some UDT on them. That's the underwater demolition team of World War II. And after this was all said and done, what President Kennedy did, he ordered an elite group to be developed, which later became known as the SEALs. And they trained at Little Creek, right where we were at. And the UDT were grandfathered in as SEALs.
Were you nervous?
I was very nervous. I was scared. I was scared. I was only 19 years old. I was scared to death. I mean, I never had a problem asking somebody and getting an answer. And when I asked friends, co-workers, and a little higher ups and that, we can't tell you. We can't tell you. We were all nervous. Every one of us was nervous. I think we all smoked back then because that was the thing, and I think we went through a lot of cigarettes, and all the pop machines all got emptied. The one thing we were told is any ship from Russia with offensive material on it can be let through, and anything with defensive material on it had to be turned back to Russia or turned back to wherever it wanted to go. So there were a few ships that we did let through because they carried medical supplies, and we don't know what they carried because nobody really physically went on board and looked, that I know. I think we were maybe within 3 miles. It was, we could see it. Once we got there, we could see land. We kept in battle readiness all the time. We always had our life jackets with us. We didn't have to have them on, but we had to have them with us, and a helmet. And this is the first time that some of the fellows that I was with that had just finished Korea had told me, by God, this is the first time we've been armed since Korea. And so as soon as we got aboard, we all were issued 45s.
For 13 days in late October, the world held its breath.
This is Radio Moscow. Premier Khrushchev has sent a message to President Kennedy today. The Soviet government has ordered the dismantling of weapons in Cuba, as well as their crating and return to the Soviet Union.
The Soviet ships turned back. The crisis was over. Khrushchev, faced with the armed might of the United States and its allies, had little choice but to find some way out of the difficult situation in which he had placed himself and his country.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis ended, Castro and Khrushchev had decided to try and spread communism in the Caribbean islands. So what we would do is we'd take a detachment of UDT with us. Again, secrecy is the ultimate to success. We found that out, and we honored that. They would be dropped off about 3 in the morning. All we had when we went out with our boats, by then I was on an LCU, which had 12 men on it, was a latitude and a longitude, and that was it on our compass. And when we got to those points where those things would cross, we dropped them. And all they had was a one tank, a mask, fins, and a little, we called it a little ditty bag like that. And they went someplace, obviously inland, okay, because we probably were about 3 miles out when we dropped them. And then we'd pick them up in about a week with a longitude, latitude, that's all we'd know, 3, 4 in the morning, and all of a sudden, there they'd be. Wow. And we'd bring them back aboard and bring them back, and of course, they can't tell you nothing. But we did see civilian clothes being hung on clotheslines because on the LSD, there's a flight deck. It's just a mesh it's a mesh steel flight deck over the well deck where the landing crafts are stored. And UDT had we called it a Connex box. It was a big steel box that had all their gear in it, and then they slept in cots up there right on deck. And they had the civilian clothes on their little clotheslines hanging up there, so we obviously knew that they probably went in and got civilian clothes on and intermixed with the people in the island and did a lot of research for CIA or whoever was going to go in there. And by the time I got out, we had gotten about 90% communism eradicated. What we did was a big step, and I think the third time we went down was right after the Dominican Republic was under siege, and it was a coup, and it had just finished up. So we were ordered to go in and get the embassy people out, the kids and the wives and that, to get them out. So we went into in the Dominican Republic and got them all. And you could see on the big seawall when you're going in, you could see all the bullet marks on the wall from whoever attacked them. I didn't get a chance to re-enlist because I had a guardian angel that wouldn't allow me to. And just before I got out, she came down and we were talking, and the commanding officer said, "Now what do you think about him re-enlisting?" And she says, "Well," she says, "we have a son, a little over a year old. His name is Jeffrey, and it's either Jeff and I or the Navy, but not both. Because I will not leave Jamestown and go to a Navy base." So the day after I got discharged, my unit was going for jungle warfare training someplace in the south, further down from Virginia. I don't know where. And I'm not documenting this for sure because I heard this through the grapevine, but evidently most of our unit was wiped out in Vietnam 6 months after that because of the fire bases that the Green Berets were setting up throughout the deltas and some of the river areas and that. They changed us from landing crafts to swift boats. And I know Raleigh Kidder was on a swift boat, and I don't know a whole lot about swift boats because I never got involved with them. So this is what we were told, is a lot of our ACU-2 guys went aboard swift boats. And they only had a 7-minute longevity, 15-minute longevity when they left the pier. You know, I think Kennedy did the right thing. He challenged Khrushchev, and he won. He backed him right into a corner. And I think, had we not done that, I don't know what the consequences would have been. I'm part of the forgotten war. She says, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, my 21-year-old son, or grandson, wanted to know what this was all about." And I said, "You didn't learn about the Cuban crisis in school?" "No," he says, "we didn't." I said, "You're kidding me." He says, "No." He says, "Matter of fact, Grandpa," he says, "I just learned about World War II because my dad and I watched Pearl Harbor." I said, "You mean they didn't teach that in high school either?" He said, "No." I said, "Did you learn about World War I?" "No." "What was that all about?" And I said, "Well, I'd have to do some research because I don't know a lot about World War I, but I said, I do know somewhat of what it was about." And he said, so I told Barb this. And Barb says, "Are you kidding me?" And this guy verified it, this guy that was in charge of us that day up on the ships. And he says, "Yeah," he said, "they're not teaching any of this stuff in school." And she said, "Well, why didn't you put together some sort of a program and get this out, and maybe we can get it around. Maybe we can get some sort of national attention or something like that." And I said, "Okay." So I talked with my daughter, and my daughter said, "Dad, I'd love to do a PowerPoint along with you on this." So this is what we did. We need to get this out, and that's why we did that.